Hello, welcome to Cashcroft TV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thanks for watching another video on our leaders. We will be covering today Erna Solberg, the current Prime Minister of Norway, also known as Jern-Erna, as well as Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan, the current Prime Minister of the United Arab Emirates, also known as Sheikh Khalifa. So without further ado, we shall begin with Erna Solberg of Norway. So Erna Solberg was born on the 24th of February 1961. She is a Norwegian politician and currently serving as Prime Minister of Norway since she originally acquired that position in 2013. She's the leader of the Conservative Party since 2004, and she's actually been the first conservative Prime Minister to win 2 terms and therefore one of the longest serving conservative leaders in all of Norwegian history. She's also the second female Prime Minister in Norwegian history, which is also quite a significant achievement as well. In terms of her early life, she was born in an affluent neighborhood known as Kalfaret in Bergen, Norway. Bergen is the second largest metropolitan area by population in Norway. It has about 430,000 people, so pretty large, obviously, for Norway and amongst some other European cities, but compared to many other cities across the globe, not particularly huge. It's located in the west of Norway. And for some further background about Norway, if you're not familiar, the capital and largest city is Oslo. So that's important just to mention because she was not born in the capital nor the largest city, so perhaps she might have grown up feeling somewhat like an outsider, but I don't think she to as big of a degree as we might see with some other leaders where they are quite noticeably an outsider. Her father was named Asbjørn Solberg. He was a consultant for Bergen Sporvei AS, which is a municipal-owned transit company in Bergen. However, he was also, like Erna, a politician, however, for a different party. He served for the Christian Democratic Party, which is more centrist than the Conservative Party, which she would go on to later lead. So I guess the main takeaway here is that growing up, her father was actually slightly more left-leaning, if you can, well, obviously he came from a municipal-owned transport company, which is a more left-leaning thing, bigger government, more state-owned enterprises. However, her father was still generally considered a centrist, and compared to many other more left-leaning parties, definitely not left-leaning by any standards. Generally speaking, it must be noted that Norway is naturally a more left-leaning state, being a welfare state, similar to Canada. If you do not work, you can get a welfare check. So a little bit more left-leaning in that respect. However, she, I guess, represents a trend towards more conservatism or slightly more right-leaning policies. Her mother was named Inger Wench Torgersen. She died in 2016, so pretty recently, actually, and she was a white-collar office worker as well. So obviously, I think at least she admired both of her parents growing up. Her father actually died a little bit earlier in 1989. I guess the takeaway is I think once a father dies, I think that's really when someone gets fully independent and really starts taking into account or taking advantage of all their opportunities and sort of gets a conceptualization of death. So perhaps around 1989 was when she sort of started establishing that. She was the middle child. She has 2 sisters, one older sister and one younger sister. I think that's important to note. I think younger children often feel as though they have to overcome both the elder child, who obviously gets quite a bit of attention and they're sort of the first to go through things, and the younger child who obviously gets to get away with more things, one might assume. I'm actually a younger child as well. I was just reading about John F. Kennedy, who was actually the younger child. His father, Joe Jr., their father's name was Joe. JFK was actually a bit of a problem child in school, partially because it said he was often overshadowed by his elder brother. So I guess just to draw a parallel here, perhaps a lot of Erna's ambition comes from being a younger sister, or perhaps even more so as a middle child. And similar, and also as a parallel to JFK, she actually struggled in school. However, not necessarily because she was a problem child, but she was diagnosed with dyslexia at 16 years old. I think it's important to note 16 years old. I think that's a bit later for a diagnosis of dyslexia. Most people who I know who have been diagnosed with dyslexia were diagnosed relatively early in their academic career. So 16 years old I think is pretty late, but I don't know if we can derive too many implications from that. However, she was still a very, generally speaking, a quite successful student. She was very talkative. She got involved in student government, and perhaps maybe she compensated for her difficulties reading. That is what dyslexia is. They sort of misassociate words and letters often, and I suppose she sort of compensated for this by becoming a good speaker, and she was a very talkative and outspoken student. In 1979, she completed her final year in high school at 20 years old, a little bit older for them. Generally, people graduate from high school 17 to 18 range, so a couple of years older. Perhaps that might have just been conventional for school, or perhaps that was conventional for as she had been diagnosed with dyslexia, but I think it was more just a commonality in her school. However, in her final year, she was elected to the board of the School Student Union of Norway. So this was a board of about 400 schools across Norway, and they advocated for the rights of the students across the country. So obviously at a very young age, in her final year of university, getting involved in human rights, I guess you could call it, or the rights of other students. As well, in her final year of high school as well, she led a national charity event called Operation Dagservark, which was a charity fundraiser event which raised money for people in poverty in Jamaica. So obviously I think early on we can also start seeing her respect for globalization and respect for addressing issues of poverty across the world. In 1986, at 25 years old, she graduated Candidata Magisterii. A male graduates with a Candidatus, and a female graduates with a Candidata Magisterii, which is essentially a Master's of Arts. It said that she studied, common in Norway, a Master's of Arts takes 5 years, so she graduated in the normal amount of time, and she studied political science, sociology, statistics, and economics. So a very broad group of fields, but I think that's, in my opinion, the best way to learn. I don't think one becomes a great mathematician by just studying mathematics. I think there's synergies from studying as many topics as one might. I think if one studies, for example, in her case, political science in conjunction with statistics, not only would she obviously have to take a sacrifice and dedicate more time generally, however, there's always synergies between multiple fields, so I think her broad educational background has been both meritorious in terms of her own studies, but also for what she could bring to ultimately the Norwegian politics. The university she achieved her master's from was called the University of Bergen, which is the second most recognized university in Norway, but as common in most of Europe, as contrast to the United States, where the United States is a lot more perhaps elitist in terms of institutions. Generally, most institutions in Europe, with the exception of the UK, where they have Oxford and Cambridge and such, are more on a level playing field. But nonetheless, it's the second most recognized university in Norway, the first being the University of Oslo. Often in many countries, the most recognized is associated with the largest city, and the second with the second largest city, and that's exactly the case here. So University of Bergen is the top in Bergen, and the second top in the country, just for being the second largest city as well. But nonetheless, a great education on her behalf. The University of Oslo, I'll quickly mention it here, is actually significant because the University of Oslo Faculty of Law actually contributes heavily to the Nobel Peace Prize, which is given out in Norway, whereas all the other Nobel Prizes are given out in Stockholm. But nonetheless, University of Oslo and University of Bergen are both very important institutions. Once again, in her final year in university, she led the student wing of the Students' League of Conservative Party in Bergen. So very early on, like we've seen with many other politicians, particularly I think we could draw an important parallel to Angela Merkel, who was also currently a very important world leader right now. She got involved in student politics very, very early, perhaps by force, perhaps not, but nonetheless, I think it's seems to be a common theme amongst many of these lives for these individuals to get involved in student politics. In 1996, when she was 35 years old, she married former Conservative Party politician and current businessman Sindre Finesse, and she currently has 2 children, and she alternately lives in Oslo and Bergen. But nonetheless, it seems as though not only was she involved in the student organizations associated with the Conservative Party, but she even found her own romantic life within the Conservative Party. So it's very important to her, despite her father coming from the Christian Democratic Party. She was ultimately elected to the Sorting in 1989 at 29 years old, which is the Supreme Legislature of Norway. However, prior to this, as soon as she graduated from her master's at the University of Bergen, she became deputy member of the Bergen City Council from 1979 to 1983. So between 18 years old to 22 years old, she got involved in municipal politics. Once again, very, very common thing for one to get involved with municipal politics into perhaps the equivalent of provincial or state level politics, ultimately into the federal government. And this is exactly what she did. It's almost like if one were reading a textbook of how to get into politics in Norway, she followed it almost to the most minute detail. Similarly, after her 18 to 22 years old as deputy member, she joined the executive committee on the city council from 1987 to 1989, 26 to 28 years old. She also chaired the municipal chapters of the Young Conservatives, so always being quite loyal to the Conservative Party. And you could see it's obvious that she had intentions of going into the Conservative Party, which is interesting because they hadn't actually fared too well in recent history in Norway. So it's interesting that she was so dedicated to this party, and she would ultimately champion it in being probably its most successful leader in its entire history. It must be noted that 26 to 28 is generally considered, once again, a little bit young to be involved in politics, but I always say, and I think this is obviously a pseudoscience, but girls tend to mature a little bit quicker, so 28 years old as a female probably has the maturity of a 30-year-old male. Obviously, there's no science to back that, but I do think girls do, for some reason, mature a bit quicker. But nonetheless, I think it was a pretty appropriate year to, at 28 years old, ultimately be elected to the Sorting, which is the Supreme Legislature. You could think of it as a member of Parliament. Her specific riding was in Hordaland, which is in the southeast of Norway. It's the 3rd largest county in Norway after Akershus and Oslo, and she's been re-elected to this riding 5 times, so very, very successful. But it's interesting to note that it's in the southeast, whereas she was actually born in western Norway, so it wasn't even a riding she was particularly attached to, but she still nonetheless got quite successful with it. As well, after she became, during this time, during one of her 5 terms as, you could call it a member of Parliament, but a member of the Sorting, she became a national conservative leader of the National Conservative Women's Association in 1994 to 1998, so 33 to 37 years old. So obviously a general theme, and I think rightfully so, she's always been a strong advocate for women's rights, but as well as the rights of children, and I think these are very important things. And obviously she's not one of these leaders where you can expect something radical to come out of her. She's really made it clear what her political intentions are from a very, very young age, and obviously that's what people ultimately responded to. From 2001 to 2005, she joined the cabinet as Minister of Local Government and Regional Development under Bondevik's second cabinet. This is a very important role in her career, and this is really where she starts to get a name for herself. As Minister of the Local Government and Regional Development in Kjell Magni Bondevik's second cabinet, as mentioned, she started establishing her really tough policies. But once again, it wasn't anything that no one would have expected of her. She took firstly, a firm stance on asylum seekers, but not in the way we have seen with many of our slightly more right-leaning leaders in Europe. In fact, in her period from 2001 to 2005, where she was serving in this position on the cabinet, they actually let thousands of more subsequent center asylum seekers enter into Norway than subsequent center-left red and green government from 2005 and 2009. So it's interesting that despite her slightly more conservative bent, she actually, and her tough policies, she's actually generally been more open to asylum seekers, which is generally something that's more accepted on the left. However, as history has shown us, the left did not even match her. In fact, they were thousands less in terms of matching her. So it's very interesting, and I think that's something that could be valued in her character, is that she's not an ideologue. She will not just vote one way because it's the right-wing ideology. She'll vote either way as to what she believes is right. So she's not just a conservative. She is a very nuanced and individual person. But nonetheless, despite given her tough policies, this is where she got the name Jern-Erna, which means Iron Erna. It's actually a testament to Margaret Thatcher, who was called the Iron Lady in the UK. She was strong. She was a very strong conservative who had fought against the strong labor unions that were growing in the United Kingdom at the time. So obviously, once again, a testament to Solberg or Erna's strength as a leader and as a woman, but also in terms of her slightly more conservative bent, which also matched Margaret Thatcher. She also, during this time, she instructed the director of immigration to expel Iraqi Kurdish scholar Mullah Kreker. So Mullah Kreker supposedly gave Erna Solberg some death threats. Later, he was found guilty of giving her death threats in 2010. But once again, just to show how sort of nuanced she is, she has been accepting of asylum seekers. However, she's not fully tolerant. In fact, if someone were to give her death threat, she instantly had them removed from the country. So once again, a very nuanced individual. But I think that's a good characteristic of an individual. I don't think we want just foil characters. We want, the main character is a dynamic one. So she's very nuanced and very open to different opinions. But should she have expelled this individual from the country? It's hard to say. I think a death threat is obviously something that should not be accepted in Norway. However, I trust that the legal proceedings were fair, and I trust her judgment, but I don't think merely a death threat is sufficient to kick someone out of the country. I think that's sort of quite a nationalist sort of policy. Could in fact even be measured up to some sort of racism, because, for example, if someone else were to give a death threat, they would just be in prison within the Norway. But nonetheless, I think she's very open to asylum seekers. But nonetheless, she's a very nuanced individual to try not to beat that point to death, however. Following this, she became deputy leader of the Conservative Party from 2002 to 2004. So by this time, she was already 41 years old. So in her 30s, she made a lot of fame for herself in terms of her role on the cabinet. However, this time she really starts going for the high leadership at 41 years old. And in 2004, she became absolute leader. Well, not absolute in terms of absolute power, but she became the leader of the Conservative Party of Norway at 43 years old. Thus, in 2009 of September, she won the general elections as prime minister. She became the second female prime minister in all of Norwegian history after Gro Harlem Brundtland, who served 3 terms and also was the general director of the World Health Organization. And she became, Erna Solberg became prime minister of Norway at 40 years old. I keep mentioning these years because I think it's important if any viewer here might be interested in following politics, or just to measure them against other politicians, what sort of timeline one might want to look at to enter into these positions of highest leadership. In 2017, she was once again re-elected as prime minister, becoming the first conservative leader to be re-elected since the 1980s. However, in this time the center-right won a majority in the Storling, so a very successful achievement for the more right-leaning parties. However, she achieved this through many alliances with various ministers and parliamentarians from across party lines. So once again, a very open individual in terms of negotiating with people with perhaps different ideologies to ultimately achieve the greatest benefit for Norway, I believe. In 2018, there was a clash with the Christian Democratic Party, which is interesting. That is the party that her father was a politician for. And thus they invited the Liberal Party to join their minority government. And this is where, once again, I think it really reveals how open she is to dealing with people with slightly different ideologies. However, the Christian Democratic Party still wanted to join, and in fact, the Conservative Party wanted them to join more, so they had a bit of a negotiation that got into a little bit of a conflict. So the Christian Democratic Party wanted to tighten abortion laws in Norway to make it more difficult after the 12th week of a woman's pregnancy to abort a child. Their sort of slogan was that children with Downs have the same rights. I think they had a couple case studies where children after the 12th week were killed or were aborted because they were found to have Down syndrome. Obviously, this is a very, very sensitive topic, and I imagine the 50% of these viewers probably have completely opposite opinions, so feel free to argue amongst yourself. But nonetheless, I think everyone can agree that obviously some cases of abortion must be done. Sometimes it has to be done. However, it shouldn't be glorified. I think it should be done in select cases. But to put finite dates on it, I think to make it more difficult after 12 weeks is probably wrong, because if someone has a reasonable reason after 12 weeks, so be it, and so let it happen. But I just think these are very, very sensitive issues, and it should be left to the individual. It should be left to the mother of the child if she wants to abort it, as long as she is really fully thought it through, so be it. But nonetheless, she gave some ground to the Christian Democratic Party and slightly tightened abortion laws, which did give her quite a bit of criticism, especially as she was trying to grow her alliance with the Liberal Party. In terms of her actual role as Prime Minister of Norway, in her 11 years, she has been chair of the Norwegian delegation to NATO Parliamentary Assembly, where she has been championed transatlantic values and security, which I think is a very important thing for any of the smaller countries of Europe, especially to try to enforce globalization. And I think the more connected the world gets, generally speaking, we get better. I would actually advocate that the European Union should be stronger. If it does not get stronger, it'll slowly crumble. And I think she is very much a globalist who wants to see the world more connected. And it also, from Norway's perspective, the more globalization the country achieves, Norway will further be able to hit above its population and GDP weight class if it's got further ties within and further strength through NATO. In terms, she supports the World Bank's Pro Blue initiative, which is an initiative to protect the marine life and protect against marine damage, particularly in the Atlantic, but globally. And thus in 2018, during the G7 summit, she actually introduced this topic at the summit and promoted the sustainable ocean economy. So one of her big passions besides children and women is also the ocean, which I think is a very worthy issue, and I think most people would generally agree with it. However, the only criticism is that it might not be the most financially wise decision, but I think it definitely deserves merit, and I think she did a very good job in terms of bringing it up at the G7. She co-chaired the UN Secretary General's Advocacy Group for Sustainable Development Goals, and once again here in this role, she focused on equal education, especially in war-torn regions, especially in conflict areas, especially for girls, young girls, and children. So once again, very common themes, and I don't think it's just because she's a woman that she cares about these issues. I think it's because she is just very in tune with where the real bottlenecks in society are. I think you don't have to be a girl or a child to see that these people should be helped, especially in war-torn areas where they perhaps cannot defend themselves as much as other individuals may. In 2017, she gave a speech in Beijing where she advocated for globalization at Peking University. And in 2018, she won the Global Citizen World Leader Award. In terms of some of her criticisms in her role as prime minister, the Russian embassy in Oslo accused Norway of anti-Russian propaganda. However, we come to our first quote here. She said of the Russian ambassador, this is an example of Russian propaganda that often comes when there's a focus on security policy. There is nothing in this that's new to us. So I don't think she's particularly anti-Russia, but I think she obviously sort of, I guess the word would be poo-pooed the criticism by Russia. I think if Norway has reasonable reasons to criticize Russia, so be it, and they should be allowed that freedom of expression. And yeah, that's just my stance on that. But she did get criticism from the Russian ambassador and Russia. In 2010, she gave the Nobel Peace Prize, well, she didn't personally, but the Oslo Law School, the University of Oslo Law School, and in effect, the Nobel Prize giving organization in Oslo gave it to Liu Xiaobo, who was a Chinese dissident, a critic of the Chinese regime and particularly communist policies. And from this, there was a rupture in the relationship with China and Norway. China deeply criticized Norway's decision to give it to this individual. However, she has since tried to recover the relationship with China. As mentioned, once again, all the other Nobel Prizes, namely physics, for example, and economics, are given in Stockholm. In 2004, as Minister of Local Government and Regional Development, as I mentioned before, where she got the title Jern-Erna, she rejected Israeli nuclear whistleblower Mordechai Vanan's asylum request. So this individual, the Norwegian immigration authorities allowed this individual, Vanan, who was a nuclear whistleblower, to seek asylum in Norway. However, she rejected this request and essentially forced him to stay in Israel. This is because she did not want to hurt the relationship between Norway and Israel, and perhaps even seem like I wouldn't say make her seem critical of the Israeli government. So that's just, I guess, part of her character. I think she perhaps puts the more global importance above, especially this individual. But in the case of the one individual who gave her the death threat, she put the individual more important than the actual objective. So I guess she's very much nuanced in that respect. Should this guy have been able to seek asylum in Norway? I think she should have at least accepted the Norwegian immigration authorities' decision. I don't think, as Prime Minister, she should have been overstepping them to that extent. I think she could have greatly criticized them openly of their decision and perhaps fought to oppose this, but merely vetoing it was wrong and sort of does a disservice to the institutions of Norway. So we'll talk more about Erna Solberg in the comparison with Khalifa after I quickly go through the last of the quotes and go through the images. So we'll do the images first. In the top left here is the flag of Norway. Population 5.358 million, so very small actually. There are cities that are larger than that. However, a GDP of 434.2 billion is quite massive for a population of that, and an area of only 285,203 kilometers squared. I guess we could consider that to be somewhat about average for a wealthy European country. In terms of the image, this top right is the seal of Bergen, which is the city she was born in. Below is the second to the top right is the seal of the University of Bergen, through which she achieved her Masters of Arts in. Second from the bottom on the right is the symbol of the Christian Democratic Party. Obviously, she was not part of the Christian Democratic Party, but I thought I'd put it there because her father was a member of the Christian Democratic Party. And I think, although she was not a part of the party, it's been a very influential force in her life and perhaps been the driving force for her to have taken a more conservative stance. And obviously in the very bottom right, we have the symbol of the Conservative Party, where she's been the champion, one of the longest serving conservative leaders of all time, and the first since the 1980s to serve 2 terms. So, and she's been dedicated to it through her whole life, partially perhaps in contrast to the Christian Democratic Party, and obviously a party she cares about and is a very crucial element of. In terms of the last 3 quotes, "The future of Norway isn't about competing on the cheapest but the most innovative. We are an expensive welfare state, and the only answer to continue that way is to become more competitive, especially on knowledge." So I think this is a nice quote because obviously she recognizes that Norway is a bit of an outlier in that, or not necessarily an outlier, is a little bit different from other countries in that it is a welfare state. Like Canada, they do hand out paychecks to people who are unemployed, but she says, and I think really gives the crux of the issue here, one may maintain a welfare state. It is fair to pay those who cannot afford to live money, so long as a certain level of innovation or certain level of GDP growth is maintained. So if, for example, Norway were to stagnate in growth, it would be very, very difficult for the welfare paychecks to continue to go out, and it would slowly lead to hyperinflation within the country, which would be very bad, and especially since they are so tied to the European Union, it would relatively hurt them more than some more isolated nations as well. So I think that's exactly the crux of it, and I think that's exactly the crux that the Canadian economy must understand too. If that we would like to stay as a welfare state, we must maintain a certain level of GDP growth. And particularly to achieve that GDP growth, either through operational efficiencies, through cost synergies, for cost cuts, or through the top line through innovation. If you want to decrease housing costs in Norway, the most important thing is to build more. I thought this was an important quote and an interesting quote to note because Canada actually has a bit of a housing crisis too, particularly in some of the more metropolitan regions. And I think this is very, very simple economics, but very, very true. I think if housing costs are too high, build more houses. I think it's so simply put, but so underappreciated amongst so many municipal governments. And I think that's a testament to her strong understanding of the municipal environment while she was on the council there. We must fight for liberal ideas like openness, but also about having a media that we believe in and that can sort between real news and facts and not so factual things. So I just think this is interesting because firstly it shows her appreciation for liberal ideas and ultimately the Liberal Party, who she had many important relationships with, but also her sort of conservative bent, the fake news sort of trend that I think came across from Donald Trump is obviously something that's characteristic of the right wing, and that is, I think this quote really sums up who she is as an individual. She's very nuanced in that she supports liberal ideas. She was somewhat opposed, although she allowed the changing of the abortion laws as a result of the Christian Democratic Party, and she likes some liberal ideas such as that of welfare. However, she also still has a conservative bent, and she is more conservative than most of her predecessors. So nonetheless, that is the life of Erna Solberg, or Iron Erna, or Jern-Erna. We'll talk about her more in the comparison after we speak about Khalifa. So Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan was born on the 7th of September 1948. He is the current president of the United Arab Emirates, Emir of Abu Dhabi, the Supreme Commander of the UAE Armed Forces, and Chairman of the Supreme Petroleum Council. So this is, in effect, if you can just sort of imagine all of these three important. He's essentially, by all measurable means the most powerful person in the UAE. Some dispute that there might be other richer individuals, such as Majid Al Fatah. However, he's the president of the UAE. He's the supreme commander of the United Arab Forces, Emirate Forces. He's the chairman of the Supreme Petroleum Council, which gives him almost complete control over the oil economy in UAE, which is probably the most important economy in the country. So obviously a hugely powerful person in the region. In addition to this, he's also the chairman of the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, which is $875 billion in assets under management, which is the largest managed by a nation's head of state in the world. So you say what you want about his actual net worth, which is obviously in the billions and very high. Some put it around 1.5 billion. Panama Papers perhaps put it at something very higher. But he has this $875 billion fund, technically almost at his full disposal. So very powerful, very rich. His family net worth is supposedly approximately 150 billion. That's not just him. Him individually is said to be around 1.5. But to put that in perspective, Jeff Bezos, as of today in 2020, Jeff Bezos has 165.2 billion, the richest man in the world, only slightly richer than supposedly Khalifa's family. Nonetheless, in terms of his early life, as mentioned, he was born on the 7th of September 1948, which actually makes calculating these days a little bit more difficult, because most of the time, we could call it 9 times out of 10 or 8 times out of 10, he will be, I gotta subtract out a year, and then for the remaining 3 or 4 times, 4 out of 12, I gotta add a year. But nonetheless, I'm just complaining for myself. He was born on September 7th of 1948, which is a bit closer to my birthday. I was born in August as well, the 8th month, September being the 9th month. But nonetheless, he was born in Fort Qasr Al Muwaji, which is actually now a very famous place, partially just because he was born there, in Al Ain, which is in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi. It is the largest inland city in all of the Emirates at 766k. However, it is the 4th largest city overall in the UAE and the 2nd largest in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi. The largest city in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi being Abu Dhabi itself at 1.45 million, and the largest overall city in all of the United Arab Emirates is, as you might know, Dubai in the 3.33 million. So quite a bit larger, but like many other countries, the capital, which is Abu Dhabi, is not necessarily the largest, and the place where he was born in was not even the largest within the province or the emirate that he was born in, and not even, 4th largest in the whole of the UAE. So an outsider, probably not, because his father ultimately went on to become the first, or you could call him the uniter of the UAE. He is the eldest son of Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan, who was the leader of Abu Dhabi for over 30 years. He's the principal of the formation of the UAE. He's also the union's first rais, the union's first president. So his father, like we saw in the previous video on C, is where Lee was the 3rd prime minister of Singapore. However, his father was the first. Obviously, in this case, Khalifa is the 2nd, and his own father was the 1st. So a little bit of nepotism. I don't think you can deny it at all, but I don't think we can fully discount his merit just because of having a powerful father. His wife, Hassa bint Mohammed bin Khalifa Al Nahyan, his father's wife, his own mother, was his father's first wife, and his father's first cousin, her father's first cousin was his dad. So somewhat of his mother was very politically powerful as well on both sides of his family, his mother and his father. He graduated, this being Khalifa, Sheikh Khalifa, as he is most commonly referred to, graduated from the Royal Military Academy in Sandhurst in the United Kingdom. Sandhurst is located in Berkshire, which is in the south, about the entrance of southwest London. So as we've seen with quite a few other leaders, for example, El-Sisi was educated in the United States in War Academy. In this case, Khalifa was educated at the Army Academy in United Kingdom. So obviously his father, or he perhaps, I think it was more his father, perhaps told him to go to the United Kingdom. Also, as we saw with Lee was sent to Cambridge as well to study in the UK. But a lot of these leaders in these many, I guess you could call them almost patriarchal or hereditary states, they are often sent to study in the United States or the United Kingdom. In most cases, not in the case of Lee where he studied mathematics, in Khalifa's case, he studied specifically war, or specifically in the army school. So obviously, I think, and as we'll see, his father had quite a military bent, and obviously valued that his son attain an education in the art of war. In 1966, his father became Emir of Abu Dhabi, which is essentially the leader of the province of Abu Dhabi, at 17 when Khalifa was 17 years old. So pretty young for Khalifa to have a father who was essentially king of one of the 7 emirates. There are 7 emirates in UAE, one of the largest being firstly Abu Dhabi, and secondly being Dubai. However, Dubai is probably, I think it has a larger population than Abu Dhabi. However, there are 7 total nonetheless. However, the Emir of Abu Dhabi effectively rules all of the UAE as a result of Khalifa's father, Zayed. After 1966, at 17 years old, when his father Zayed became Emir of Abu Dhabi, Khalifa was quickly appointed to the ruler's representative, or the mayor of the eastern region of Abu Dhabi, as well as head of the court department of Al Ain, where he was born. So at 17 years old, he's already the head of a court in the city he was born in, and the mayor of the capital of what would soon to become the UAE. So obviously a huge amount of power for a 17-year-old. I would call him a boy, but I think 17 years old, we could call him a 17-year-old guy, but still quite young. In 1969, February 1st, when he was 20 years old, he was nominated Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, so essentially heir to Abu Dhabi, which would effectually mean he would be leader of all of UAE after his father Zayed would become president. The next day, on February 2nd, he also became head of Abu Dhabi Department of Defense when he was 20 years old. So head of the Defense Department of the province, a very powerful position for a 20-year-old. And through this time as leader of, or head of the Abu Dhabi Department of Defense, he oversaw the build-up of the force, which ultimately in 71, in the UAE independence, became the forces of the entire UAE. So his father essentially gave him the provincial rule of the military, and then his father would go on to amalgamate the states of the UAE, and effectually the military that Khalifa was running became the military of the entirety of the UAE. So in 1971, 2 years later, at 22 years old, perhaps closer to 21 years old, the UAE became independent, and his father became prime minister. The UAE is fully established. His father became prime minister and head of the Abu Dhabi cabinet. Khalifa became prime minister after his father had become president, and he became the head of the Abu Dhabi cabinet under his father, who was obviously in complete control at this point. He also, during this time, became defense minister and as well finance minister. Once again, for perhaps a big parallel you'll see with a lot of these lives, most of these individuals, before becoming leader or head of state, they often serve as Minister of Finance, is a very common role. Defense minister depends on how much of a tilt the state has towards warfare. After the reconstruction of cabinet of the UAE, where the Abu Dhabi cabinet became the Abu Dhabi Executive Council, Khalifa became the second deputy prime minister of the UAE, the 23rd of December 1973, when he was only 25 years old. And after that, he became chairman of the Executive Council on January 20th of 1974, when he was 26 years old. So chairman of essentially the cabinet at 26 years old is a huge amount of power to have for a 26-year-old. In 1976, he became deputy commander of the armed forces. His father was commander, but essentially his father was starting to get older. His father had already achieved independence for the UAE and fully amalgamated the states, and effectually his son Khalifa, although still quite old, was getting more and more powers as invested in him by his father. In the late 1980s, he became head of the Supreme Petroleum Council, which is the supreme oil authority in the UAE, and gave him pretty much complete control over the supply of oil in the UAE. One thing must be noted, though, is that OPEC actually pretty much controls the price of oil. So although he has so much control over oil within the country, he does not have complete control over oil prices. That is largely controlled by Saudi and OPEC. And soon after, he also became chairman of environmental research and wildlife development. So it's sort of just an honorary role. Obviously, he did work in it, but mostly just another role to fill into his position toolkit. Thus, in 2005, at 55 years old, he finally succeeds his father at his post as Emir of Abu Dhabi and president of the UAE on November 3rd of 2004, 55 years old. His father, Zayed, died the day before on the 2nd. However, he had largely already sort of become president as after his father had previously already gotten sick, and essentially Khalifa was just being groomed to become president and Emir of Abu Dhabi and president of all of the UAE. But nonetheless, 55 years later, despite having almost complete control or incredible power since the age of 17, at 55 years old, he finally gets the complete power that he was sort of waiting for his whole life. On the 1st of December of 2005, he stated that half of the Federal National Council, which sort of advises the president, would be indirectly elected. Previously, they had been obviously directly elected by the president himself. And however, this was sort of done for a more democratic measure by saying indirectly elected. That would mean that people from more diverse regions could find a position of power. However, they are still largely appointed by leaders of emirates. So still a very big bureaucracy. To get into the actual council, one has to really mooch up to a emirate, not necessarily an emirate in Abu Dhabi, but they really got to mooch up, and everyone's sort of mooching up to Khalifa anyways. But nonetheless, it was nice that he took a slightly more democratic step. In 2010, the U.S. Ambassador Richard G. Olson, in a WikiLeaks leak, or WikiLeaks cable it's called, stated that this is the U.S. ambassador in the UAE, said that he is a distant and uncharismatic personage. So this obviously would probably hurt the relationship between the UAE and the United States, but nonetheless, it sort of shows how many of the people see Khalifa. Despite being extremely powerful, he's not a very outspoken person. He's not particularly charismatic. I think it's because he already has been groomed for this position for so long. It was already essentially chosen for him by his father. All he really had to do was sort of try to keep as quiet as possible and not rock the boat too much, and to ensure that he would get the power. Whereas someone who came from nothing would have to rock the boat as much as possible in the hopes of getting up there. So two different methods of getting to power, which I'll explain later, but I think that would be very, very meritorious to study through Plutarch. On January 4th of 2010, the Burj Khalifa, the world's tallest man-made construction, was built, and named after Khalifa in honor of his presidency. The Burj Khalifa was designed by Adrian Smith, an American who also designed the Willis Tower, which was for a time the tallest building in Chicago, as well as One World Trade Center. And soon they will be creating the Jeddah Tower in Saudi Arabia. However, construction got stopped and it should continue again this year in 2020, but perhaps COVID might delay it. But nonetheless, I think Burj Khalifa, no matter how long Khalifa himself lives, will always be a relic to represent his leadership. Sort of like, I was thinking when the Nazi Germany invaded France, the Eiffel Tower still remained the Eiffel Tower. So France was for part of Nazi Germany, but the Eiffel Tower still lasted. And I think that I was thinking to myself, who has a better legacy? Louis Eiffel, the guy who designed the Eiffel Tower, or perhaps even someone like Adolf Hitler. I think perhaps you could make the argument that the Eiffel Tower will probably last until the end of human existence, but there is a chance people might forget about certain conquerors, such as Adolf Hitler. It's hard to say, but nonetheless, having a building or that with your name on it guarantees a huge, huge legacy. But I wanted to mention the fact that it will be surpassed soon, just to show that despite all the power he has, despite all the achievements he has, we'll soon to talk about his yacht, which for a time was the longest boat in the world, there may and often will always be a bigger fish, and obviously solely searching prestige is it's an absolute that can never be fully attained. But I'll really elaborate on this more in the comparison at the end. Furthermore, with respect to his presidency, in March of 2011, he sent the UAE forces to topple the Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi alongside NATO, Qatar, Sweden, and Jordan. So this is a very sensitive one. Perhaps I might even discuss this in further detail in the future. However, Muammar Gaddafi was obviously, as you know, toppled in 2011. He lost for a while he had good relations with the United States, but it's their relationship crumbled and he was destroyed. And since then, Libya has been controlled by various militias, some former Gaddafi, some various militias, but there's no law and order there. And there is a strong case to be made that Gaddafi, despite some of the wrong things he did, actually was very beneficial for the economy, and perhaps killing him might not have been the best thing to do. This was a big discussion, especially with Erdogan in Turkey. Perhaps I'll discuss this in future, but Erdogan has been accused of doing some very wrong things to the Turkish people, but to remove him would probably do more harm than he's doing. But obviously these are very, very sensitive and very nuanced discussions that could go in immense amount of detail. But nonetheless, I think him contributing to the toppling of Gaddafi was maybe less so the result of his actual beliefs, but more an attempt to align himself with the United States, as well as Qatar and Sweden and the rest of NATO, and as well Jordan. So nonetheless, it was I think it was just, I don't think it necessarily fully represents his political ideologies, but shows his tilt towards making alliance and a step towards globalization. Perhaps the cost of having Gaddafi goes down might be, maybe the benefit of uniting these nations for a time was better than the ultimate cause. But nonetheless, I've digressed already too much on this one. He supported the Bahraini regime in 2011. There were many pro-democracy uprising in Bahrain. However, he supported the government. This is, once again, a very sensitive one. However, I do think today the Bahraini government is generally more respected than it was back in 2011, and I don't think military intervention at that time was justified. But once again, perhaps what if the United States or NATO had entered? Would Khalifa have joined in? I would say probably at this time. This was the same year as Gaddafi, but they already had something on their plate nonetheless. But I think it shows that he's nuanced in that he doesn't just want to top leaders. He doesn't want to just support leaders. He can understand both sides of the argument, and that was something that I very much valued in Solberg's case, in that she could see both sides of the argument and not be a complete ideologue. In 2011, he was ranked the fourth wealthiest monarch in the world at 15 billion. Or obviously, I'm gonna give many different price points as to his wealth. I've also seen his net worth valued at 1.5 billion. I've seen his family at 150 billion. So this is a magnitude of 100 in terms of differential. But obviously, he's a billionaire and incredibly rich. He has an $875 billion assets under management fund almost at his disposal. And at this point, I don't think money is really that valuable to discuss, no pun intended. In 2013, he commissioned the Azam, which is a super yacht. At the time, it was the longest motor yacht ever built at 590 feet, which is about the size of a ferry, or it's absolutely massive. But once again, at what point is enough? Because since then, there has been a new yacht by a Norwegian billionaire. Interesting, because we're discussing a Norwegian leader, Solberg, who built a longer yacht. It's for a slightly different purpose, slightly less luxurious, but it is longer. And there is also in the Saudi port now a more voluminous yacht. So the point is that he has complete control over his country, essentially control over the military, control over the oil supply, billionaire, and someone's still going to build a bigger yacht. They'll make it longer, they'll make it more voluminous. He had the tallest building named after him. Someone else will build the tallest building after him in Jeddah. I think at one point does one realize that money is not the most important thing, and I don't even think he realizes this. I think if he were still completely obsessed with prestige, I think he'd be trying to buy a new yacht. I think he'd be trying to build an even taller building. But I think it's just he's sort of over it. It's not. I'll discuss this more, but it's obviously can be a means to an end, but it's definitely not sufficient. Because it's an absolute that can never be fully attained. On January of 2014, at 66 years old, he had a stroke. So once again, despite all the great things that have happened to him, he's still entitled or still suffers as well. Having a stroke is obviously something that, despite you might be jealous of him, but you still have to empathize that having a stroke is not a good thing, and you shouldn't wish that even on your worst enemy, let alone a billionaire or an emir. In terms of other notable facts about him, he married Shazma bint Suhail in 1964, when supposedly, if the calculations are correct, he was only 15 years old when he married her. That's very, very young. And from what I see, he has between 6 to 8 children, so a lot of children as well. Supposedly, he's building a palace in the Seychelles. Supposedly, he bought 66 acres for $2 million. However, $130 million has been given to the Seychelles government for they call social services, etc., from the UAE government fund. So supposedly these are just government funds being funneled into Khalifa's 66-acre palace. Perhaps it's because he's no longer trying to build the tallest building in the world and no longer trying to get the biggest yacht in the world, but now he's trying to go for the biggest palace in the world. Perhaps he still is obsessed with greed, or perhaps not. Perhaps he's just sort of a later in life sort of passion, sort of like Steve Jobs when he was dying of cancer. He dedicated almost all his waking hours just to building this yacht. I don't think it was a greed thing. I think it was just something to occupy him after already having so much. Nothing could really satisfy him. In 2016, in the Panama Papers, it said that $1.67 billion in London, England properties were owned by him via shell companies built by Mossack Fonseca. That was a former law corporation I guess it would be an LLC, but either way, a former law organization in Panama who were notorious for building shell companies for billionaires to hide their money from taxes. and as well as administrators in the British Virgin Islands. So not to talk about this too much in detail, but I think it's firstly slightly wrong that he built these shell companies. Basically, he wanted to acquire a bunch of property in London, but did not want to pay taxes to the UK government. Perhaps maybe it was from a nationalist perspective. Maybe he'd rather the money stay in the UAE or within his own family. But nonetheless, I think building shell companies is something that's wrong. Another thing on this, and not to go into too much detail, but my family name is Ashcroft. There's a billionaire named Lord Michael Ashcroft who's been convicted of in the Panama Papers of forming shell corporations and tax evasion. I think it's a sensitive topic, I guess. I think, firstly, taxes should not be outwardly avoided. Obviously, to some extent, shell corporations are wrong. But the question is, who would spend the money better? For example, a lot of people criticize Bill Gates for being so wealthy, but what would be better if Bill Gates were to deploy his own capital, through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or to arbitrarily give it off to the government, who would sort of distribute it down funnels and perhaps even send it into wasteful organizations or wasteful causes. Whereas Bill Gates, I think, is the reason why he's so wealthy is because he's a great capital allocator. I think it might be better for Bill Gates to distribute the money than the government to distribute the money. It's obviously a debate. Perhaps it's not binary. It's not like Bill Gates should distribute all of his money. It's not like Khalifa should distribute all of his money, but it's not like the government should distribute all of their money. So it's obviously a very, very nuanced topic. But I think outwardly, if one is going above and beyond to avoid taxes, it does seem like something somewhat wrong. So we'll go through the quotes here, and then we will go in through the comparison. So here in the top left, that is the flag of the UAE, United Arab Emirates. Population 9.631 million. Not actually that large considering Dubai has about 3.33 million, so about a third of the people in the United Arab Emirates live all in Dubai. So roll a three-sided die if such a thing existed, and probably somewhere. Most likely they live in Dubai. GDP of 414.2 billion, slightly smaller than that of Norway. However, perhaps they've got even more money. Perhaps it's hard to say. Like, for example, the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority has 875 billion by itself in terms of assets under management, so that's different from GDP. But nonetheless, at one point you gotta wonder to what amount of merit is it worth calculating. But I think in terms of GDP as a proxy, 414.2 billion seems about right in terms of their political influence. Comparing them to Norway, I think they're about as politically important or significant in the global world as Norway. So I think that it fits in well, at least for finding pairs in that respect. An area is actually a bit smaller than Norway at 83,600 kilometers squared. In terms of the symbols, in the top right, we have the symbol of the triangular states, which was the British named region for the states bordering Oman, particularly El Ain, where he was born. It was actually known as Pirate Coast originally when the British named it as well. So a history of perhaps a lot of piracy, I guess we can assume. Second from the top right, we have a symbol of the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst in Berkshire, United Kingdom, that Khalifa attended. Second from the bottom on the right, we have the symbol of Abu Dhabi, the seal of Abu Dhabi, which Khalifa is the emir of, and the province or the emirate through which he was born. And the very bottom right, we have the symbol of the United Arab Emirates Armed Forces, which he established or grew through at one time, leading the Abu Dhabi Armed Forces. Into the quotes. Thanks to the competence, love of God, our country's security and stability, endowed wealth, integrated infrastructure, and quality services, the UAE turned into the world's renowned destination for tourism, investment, and business management. The interface of choice for hosting multicultural events, artistic, and sport in the world. So I think what we can take away here is that he really does value what the rest of the world thinks of the UAE. These are all very global values. Arts and sports are something that is, he would like to see the UAE seen as a large producer of arts and sports. I think, although at a certain level, at a most minute level, sports, for example, do cause conflict, you would say, like it does form tribalism, but also since everyone agrees, for example, the game of football or soccer as they call it in the United States, although there are different teams and sometimes teams will fight each other, everyone sort of buys in the idea of football or soccer, and it brings people together, and at a small cost of a little bit of competition, but I think they're very good things, and it's nice to see that he appreciates these things, and he's not just solely dreaming about who has the biggest yacht. He actually would like to see the UAE become a real global powerhouse. And also, I guess, a couple other takeaways here. Obviously, he has a love of God. I think he is a religious person. Perhaps not the most religious person. The UAE is actually slightly, on average, less religious than perhaps more conservative states in the Middle East, such as Saudi. However, he obviously is a religious person, and I think generally speaking, that's a really good thing. And just a broad amount of interests and infrastructure and services, the two sides of the economy. Obviously, despite his educational background coming from solely the military, he is familiar with the main value drivers of an economy. Last quote here: the backbone of any improvement of governments, its development as well as its protection from any form of wastage or excessiveness, is mechanism to place laws under the microscope of revision and modernization until they resonate in tune with the methodological development and new administrative technologies. So it's really interesting to see how he really approaches the governance-y and the process of making laws in a really technical sense. And I think this is because in some ways you could see his father and him as a type of engineer. His father was the first president of the new entity of the UAE after the independence, and they really had to sort of engineer what the government would look like and how to keep the states of the UAE together. So I think it is, to defend the amount of power he has, I think it's important that he has a lot of power, especially when UAE is still in a process of fully iterating through and developing their governance system. So in a defense of why he has so much power, maybe if he had less power, we'd see a lot more perhaps violence, a lot more militias trying to take control. Perhaps his power and his wealth are precisely what he needs. So that is the life of Sheikh Khalifa and Erna Solberg. We will go into the comparison now. So in terms of a similarity between both of them, obviously, I guess we could briefly talk about the differences, but you can probably derive or quickly figure out most of them. One is obviously perhaps the result of heritage and nepotism, that being Sheikh Khalifa. However, Erna Solberg, her father was a politician, however, from a different party, so I don't think we can really pull the full nepotism card or heritage card, so a little bit different in their upbringing. Their educational backgrounds are different. From the sounds of it, Khalifa seems like he's a little bit more technically focused, a little bit quieter as well, a little bit more of an introvert, whereas Erna Solberg is more of a humanities focus. She took a broad spectrum of humanities studies and less of a technical person, less of a reader even as a result of perhaps her dyslexia, and much more of an orator and much more of a speaker. And in terms of a similarity, they are both generally more globalist individuals. UAE has been one of the best countries in the Middle East in terms of establishing relationships, not just with NATO in the West, but ultimately within the region as well. Same thing with Norway. Norway is very much respected as a country to build bonds and advocate for globalization. And I think that's probably, if anything, the most important feature of these two leaders. In my opinion, I would like to see the world more and more united. I think as we go, the world gets more de-unified, we get closer and closer to tribalism, and things just get bad. So I think closer to one world governance, the better. And I think both of these leaders are contributing to it. And I guess the main takeaway here that I wanted to mention is that money is not everything. In fact, it's not even sufficient. I think obviously we can see that Sheikh Khalifa is much richer than Erna Solberg. In fact, probably over 100 times. We'll say probably Erna Solberg has maybe about 1 million. Khalifa has at least 1 billion, so at least 1,000 times. Perhaps he's got 10 billion, then he's 10,000 times. He's so much more rich. But at the final analysis, who is more powerful? They're pretty close. You know, you could make the argument that Erna Solberg is more powerful. You can make the argument that Sheikh Khalifa is more powerful. But money is really not the final decisive feature. In fact, I don't even think it helped Khalifa in rising. His father was more militaristically powerful, and that's what sort of led them to getting the power. And I think the money was just sort of a result of the power that he achieved. To put it also into perspective, if most people or a lot of people consider Majid Al Futtaim to be the #1 richest individual in the UAE, and he's obviously richer, or perhaps you might dispute it, you could say he's richer than Sheikh Khalifa. However, I don't think anyone can doubt that Sheikh Khalifa is more powerful and more influential. Similarly, the Burj Khalifa that Sheikh Khalifa had named after him, or the super yacht, if he were to build a bigger yacht or a taller building, it would do really nothing. In fact, that's why I think his most important objective is to optimize the UAE economy, which I think he has really done. I think if you go to Dubai, you will see that it is really flourishing. It is a touristic hub around the world. It is admired, and it is considered one of the most liberal places in the UAE. Perhaps that could be a differentiation feature, is that Erna Solberg is moving her state slightly more to the right, whereas Khalifa is moving his slightly more to the left. But nonetheless, I think they are converging somewhere in the middle. To fully complete this point, some famous Norwegian individuals such as DJ Kygo or Jens Stoltenberg, or perhaps even Magnus Carlsen, who is the top chess player in the world. Obviously Khalifa is much richer than Magnus Carlsen, but is Magnus Carlsen less influential? It's hard to say. I think if Magnus Carlsen perhaps were to say something or post something or even write a book, I think a very large number of people would view it. So I think something that, and I would recommend perhaps you watch the video series I made on all of Plutarch's lives, is that many of the lives came from no wealth. Oftentimes they achieved wealth throughout the process, but the correlation is weak, if at all it exists. In Plutarch's lives, I would say maybe 70%, even maybe 60% were born wealthy or achieved wealth. And especially from a populist standpoint, often it can be a great hindrance to be overly wealthy. Perhaps the next leader of UAE, if it does not become Sheikh Khalifa's son, perhaps, or if it does, perhaps the wealth could be one of the reasons why there might be perhaps an uprising or something. So perhaps, and especially in other states, that's why one of the reasons why Donald Trump has gotten quite a bit of criticism, or even probably more directly, Michael Bloomberg was not really seen in tune with the people. He was just too rich to be really understood by the people. So I guess the main takeaway here is that globalization is good, and secondly, that money is not everything, and in fact, it's not even sufficient. So thank you so much for watching this video on Erna Solberg of Norway and Sheikh Khalifa of the United Arab Emirates. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you continue to support. Thanks so much. Bye.